We've got a 2003 Chevy Suburban 5.7 liter gas engine. Got a complaint today that we're losing antifreeze, and we've also got some steam coming from the front and some dripping coming from below. It's a little hard to see in the video, but we've got coolant splashed all the way up towards the top. Coolant splashed all over the belts and pulleys down there. You can see the water pump down there on the top. It's pretty dry. Down below we can see a lot of dripping. I still have not, pinpointed exactly where it's coming out. There's a lot dripping down this wiring harness here. I really wish I could see down inside of here and see where it's coming from. We may have to take off this upper air intake tube, maybe the upper fan shroud, till we can actually see where it's coming out of. It's very likely the water pump, but still not 100% sure. Finally was able to get a shot of the weep hole. I can hear a little bit of belt squeak. Not unusual if you get antifreeze on these belts. They might get glazed and squeak on you. We'll have to see if that goes away for us. There are a lot of great videos out there online about replacing these water pumps, so I'm probably not going to outdo them. So I'm just going to show a few things. One, I've just taken off this air intake tube. Basically, loosen the clamp there. Loosen the clamp there. You can leave that mass airflow sensor connected. No need to take that loose. There is one connection here going around the upper radiator hose. That needs to come off. Then wiggle that bad boy out of there. Get the clamp loose, holding this upper radiator hose to the upper fan shroud. Remove the two 10mm bolts holding the top of the fan shroud. Then down here there are 4 plastic clips. You pry the center part up and then it'll pull out of there. 2 on each side. There's a little hose here you'll have to remove from the clip. Upper fan shroud is loose now, so just work that up around the upper radiator hose and get it out of there. Now you've got to remove that fan and fan clutch. There's a 36mm nut screwed to the front of that water pump. Get yourself a big, like a 15-inch crescent wrench in there. I got lucky. I put it in there, gave it a quick rap with my hand, and bang, it came undone. They do make special tools that you can hold that pulley in place and then give it a rap. Or another technique might be to grab that tensioner over there, have someone turn it the opposite direction to put more tension on the belt, and then try and smack it. But I got really lucky. About the second time I hit it, bang, it unloosened. So now we'll just spin that fan off of there and get it out of the way. There's those holes where you can get a special tool in there, hold that pulley steady. In this case, it didn't need it. The next step is to take off the serpentine belt. The car does come with some standard diagrams here, but if they are faded or you just want to be extra careful, I like to draw my own diagram. Here I've got a 15mm wrench on the tensioner, and I'll show you if I wanted to turn it the opposite direction and apply extra tension to the belt that might help me break loose that fan clutch. You could pull up, but I'm going to actually pull down. That loosens it and I can get that belt off. Once you bend the belt a little bit, those cracks really tend to show up. In this case, the belts look in good shape. My only concern is they've had antifreeze dripped on them. Sometimes if they then slip, they'll get glazed and you'll get a squeak. But we'll probably just try and wash these up and reuse it. You need to remove 3 15mm bolts from that belt tensioner. I think 2 of them are long, 1 of them might be short, so keep track of where they go. You want to look that tensioner over pretty good. Make sure the pulley spins good, no bearing issues. Make sure there's not a lot of excessive play, it's not coming apart. Everybody's got their ways of draining the coolant. I'm just going to loosen that lower radiator hose. I've got a great big bucket. It's actually a sled for my kids. Crack that hose off of there. Do the best I can to point it down toward that bucket. Get this thing drained out. Now I'm going to loosen and remove those 2 5/8" heater hoses from the water pump. If you're lucky, you can just reach down there and wiggle it and the hose will turn. This one here is a little bit tighter, so I may have to get my channel locks. Just grab this hose a little bit, give it a gentle wiggle. Get it moving, now you can get it off. Actually, a lot's coming out of those. Now we're just going to remove this upper radiator hose from the water pump. At this point, a lot of people will take off the 2 bolts and get that thermostat out of the way. But I think I'm just going to leave it on there. We'll deal with it once we get the pump out. So we're almost there. We just got 6 10mm bolts, 3 on each side. Get those 6 off. That entire water pump assembly will come out of there. Note there was no need to remove that idler pulley. Typically after you take all 6 bolts out, the water pump will still stay there. You got to kind of give it a wrap to bust it loose from the gasket surfaces, but that may not always be the case, so be ready for it to drop. I've been watching the bolts as they came out. They're all the same length. Gave it a quick jerk and it separated, and a gush of coolant went on down. So we'll get it up and out of there. Now with the water pump up and out, you can see that weep hole. You can see the fluid that's been coming out of that weep hole. If you wanted to, now would be a great time to flush this engine. You know, just shove a garden hose in here, shove a garden hose in the other side, get her all flushed out and clean. Then maybe take some compressed air and blow out most of it. The next step is to clean these gasket surfaces. Get this area down here cleaned up and ready for the new water pump to go on. Scrape and scrape. I've got the gasket surfaces scraped fairly clean. Now I'm going to grab some emery cloth and just polish it up a little bit. Follow that with maybe a paper towel and some brake clean or some acetone. and these gasket surfaces will be ready for reassembly. You want to set your new one right beside your old one. Make sure you got a match. In this case, they're exactly perfect. We're going to need to swap that thermostat out. I would recommend getting a new thermostat, but in this case, we're going cheap. We're going to try and reuse the old one. Comes with this piece of rubber here on the threads. Obviously you're going to want to take that off. This is a water pump from O'Reilly's. Came with some gaskets, new one for the thermostat, and an O-ring. There's some instructions here. You may want to look at that. I think there's different style thermostats, so you may need to use an O-ring for one and a gasket for another. Check that out. Here's the instructions that came with the water pump related to the thermostat. So I look for the year 2003, Suburban K1500. Down here it says we need the 2 steel gaskets. 1 O-ring at the paper gasket is not required. If you had more like an 05, 06, something like that, then it's a little bit different. I'm going to take these water pump bolts over to the wire wheel, get them cleaned up. When we go for reassembly, anything that screws into the water pump, which is aluminum, we'll put a little anti-seize on the threads. In the instructions there's a note about using a gasket sealer. Basically, if you got the paper gaskets, it's recommending a thin coat on each side. But if you've got the rubberized gaskets like we do, it's saying only use silicone grease if you're going to use anything, because the sealers will cause premature failure. So I think I'm just going to go on dry. I'm going to get this old thermostat housing pulled off of there, get it moved over to the new one using the proper O-ring. There is an orientation on the thermostat. There's a little notch in there, lines up. There is a little, I call a little jiggler valve, a little bleed valve right there. They probably want that to be, you know, faced in a certain position, probably up. The original plan was to try and reuse this thermostat, but this gasket was just too floppy and loose, and I couldn't get it to go into the thermostat housing correctly. When I took it apart, it looked like it had been pinched, and it kind of rolled the lip over. So it's just way too floppy on here. The new one, you know, fits nice and tight on there, so it's going to slip right into that housing. Slide right in there, should be no issue. Yeah, that new one just dropped right in the hole, no problem at all. I fiddled around for quite a while trying to tuck this one in, finally gave up. Now, those great instructions that came with it said that, you know, you're supposed to use this O-ring somehow, but I don't see how that's going to work at all. There's no groove, and I'm pretty sure that this one's designed to mate up against that thermostat gasket, so just going to put it together like this. I noticed when I took it apart, when I got the last bolt out, it kind of popped up. It actually kind of bottoms out, so you have to kind of push it in a little bit. So you want to go ahead, get both bolts started. Make sure they're straight, tighten them evenly, and pull that spring down. Put a little anti-seize on those thermostat bolts. They go into aluminum. The instructions said not to use any kind of adhesives or sealers on these gaskets, so I'm just going to have to stick the bolts through them and work the whole assembly in there with the kind of the bolt threads sticking out and holding the gaskets on. I'm going to put just a little glob of wheel bearing grease on each one of these bolts just to kind of hold them in place a little better. Get the 6 bolts started. Then just verify that your gaskets are on correctly. Going to want to go ahead and snug those 6 bolts down, just snug them. Then kind of go in an X pattern. We're going to tighten it up to, I believe it's 22 foot-pounds. Water pump's all torqued down. Now it's basically just do the steps in reverse. You got your hoses, your serpentine belt, got a tensioner pulley. I just put some anti-seize on the bolts for that. Get that back on. You know, we're going to fill her up with antifreeze, bleed the system, all that kind of stuff. But essentially, that's it. Got the serpentine belt tensioner installed. We checked earlier, but you know, make sure this pulley turns freely. Check your idler pulley. Now go ahead and turn your water pump. Make sure that turns good. I'm going to get that rubber piece off of there that's protecting the threads. I put just a little dab of anti-seize on there. Maybe the next guy will get it easy. Want to make sure you follow that serpentine belt around. Make sure you don't have any places like that where it's not fully on the pulley. So I'll loosen that tensioner, get that straightened out, and the belt will be on. I've got the upper radiator hose kind of tucked up high here, still disconnected. I'm going to go ahead and fill at least the first gallon through here. It's a good way to bleed it. Came about a half a cup short of getting the entire gallon to go in there. I'm going to go ahead and put the fan back on. Just want to look it over, make sure there's no cracks in any of the blades. Not any excessive, oil leaking out of it. This should turn, but it should be fairly stiff. That's the clutch in there. Should be no wobble in this nut, but it should turn a little bit. Got the fan and fan clutch back on. We're going to go ahead and install the upper half of the shroud. You notice there are some little alignment pins here that the upper shroud piece slides into, so we'll go ahead and get that in there. Install those 4 plastic holders and the 2 10mm bolts that go up here on the top. Get this upper radiator hose clamp, snap back in. Get the upper radiator hose on, clamp tight. There's a little clamp here for that hose. Get that in there. There's a little spot up here. That hose gets clamped in there as well. If you want to, now's a great time to do a throttle body cleaning. Spray a little carb cleaner in there, crack the throttle open, wipe around with a towel. Get the air intake tube, snap back on. Make sure it's all the way on there. All the way on there. Get those 2 clamps tightened. There's a little clip here for the upper radiator hose. Top off the reservoir tank. Then we'll start it. Turn the heaters on, all that kind of stuff. Let it warm up. Add fluid as necessary. I suppose it's always a good idea to disconnect the negative battery terminal. I didn't do it. I wasn't messing with any electrical connectors. I didn't see any real reason to do it, so I got away with it. Go ahead and get it started. Check for any excessive leaks or any leaks at all underneath the vehicle. Properly dispose of the old antifreeze. I whipped this little wrench together today. Actually didn't need it, but basically there's just some number 10 screws in a piece of bar steel. Those screws just drop into these holes. That allows you to hold that pulley still while you take that 36mm wrench and smack that nut loose. Those holes are 1.8 inches apart, center to center.